Something is happening in Russia, something big and dark, and with the potential to define the outcome of the war with Ukraine once and for all. It's been building up over time, slowly but surely growing in the shadows, now reaching a size and scope that can no longer be ignored. Even the Russian President Vladimir Putin, for all his bluster, boasting, lies and propaganda, is utterly powerless to stop it, and it revolves around something he cares about the most: money. We're talking, of course, about the ongoing and increasingly dramatic economic collapse of Russia, and it's something that's been talked about since the very beginning of the war. Soon after the invasion occurred, countries across the Western world began making plans to impose major financial sanctions on Russia. Some sanctions had already been in place since the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, but from 2022 onwards, these economic penalties really ramped up. Numerous nations joined the cause, with enormous amounts of Russian assets frozen and major restrictions imposed upon Russian banks and businesses. There have been multiple rounds of sanctions as the war has progressed, and many nations have sought to decrease their reliance on Russian energy and cut ties with the Kremlin's economy in whatever ways they can. Financial experts and analysts hoped that this would, in time, lead to an economic collapse across Russia, preventing the country from continuing its war with Ukraine. And there's no doubt that sanctions have taken its toll. They have impacted the value of the Russian ruble and contributed to shortages of goods and price hikes for everyday essentials. Russian oligarchs, too, have seen their wealth diminish, and the Russian people have seen their lives get worse, with Western brands leaving their nation and the cost of living going up year after year. However, sanctions have not necessarily caused the complete breakdown of the Russian economy, as some experts optimistically expected. This is because Russia found ways to work around them, and it started putting plans in place over a decade ago, around the time of the Crimea annexation. From 2014 onward, the Kremlin began identifying and reducing vulnerabilities in its economic system. It built up foreign exchange reserves, minimized external debts, and gradually scaled down its reliance on Western technologies and financial systems, so that even if the West were to impose sanctions someday, they wouldn't have such a devastating impact. Russia also reduced its dependence on imported goods by taking steps to strengthen some of its core domestic industries like manufacture and agriculture, and it began to pivot its trade relations too, building bonds with nations to the east and south like China and India in Asia, who have since gone on to become the two biggest buyers of the Kremlin's fossil fuels to this day. It used various other methods too, like strict capital controls and increased government spending to stabilize important industries. So when the sanctions hit and Western nations suddenly stopped spending so much on Russian resources, the country was able to avoid an instant and chaotic collapse. Its economy certainly contracted and the value of the ruble fell sharply early on, but the Kremlin managed to stabilize the situation, helped heavily by China and India, as well as other nations like Turkey, and even the EU, which has still continued to buy some Russian fuel despite massively reducing its overall expenditure. Putin and his Kremlin cronies have on numerous occasions expressed great pride at the fact that Russia has, seemingly, been able to withstand the weight of Western sanctions. Indeed, as far back as 2022 at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum in June of that year, Putin gleefully boasted, "The economic blitzkrieg against Russia was doomed from the beginning. It's obvious that they have failed. It didn't happen. They didn't succeed." And the Russian president has expressed similar sentiments on numerous occasions since then. In early 2023, for instance, he said, "The Russian economy and management system turned out to be much stronger than the West believed." Later that same year, he added, "Overall, it's safe to say that the stage of recovery of the Russian economy is over. We have withstood the absolutely unprecedented external pressure, the sanctions onslaught of some ruling elites in the Western Bloc, in individual countries that we call unfriendly." Putin has even gone on record to say that sanctions have hurt the West more than they have hurt Russia, but he of course is a master of propaganda. It's a tool he's used throughout his career to gain power and solidify it, and the Kremlin has no qualms lying to its people, plucking fake figures and suspicious statistics from thin air to back up its claims, hiding the truth by any means necessary. It got away with it for a while. Russia's leadership managed to save face, to cover up the impact of sanctions, and even to outside observers, the country appeared to be coping. It continued to invest heavily in its military, sending soldiers to the front lines and firing massive amounts of weapons, primarily drones and missiles, toward towns and cities across Ukraine. It's managed to maintain strong rates of recruitment too, calling up tens of thousands of new troops each month, offering big cash incentives and high salaries to encourage those in poorer regions to join the fight. On home soil too, in major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, life has largely appeared to continue as normal, particularly for the wealthier elements of Russian society. And in many ways, Russia has appeared to remain functional and stable, all thanks to the smart, proactive plans put in place prior to the invasion. It's leaned on its various support systems, massive war chest reserves, and new trading partners to essentially prop up its economy and save face. But the cracks have started to show, and they're getting far too big and deep to ignore any longer. Because the truth of the matter is that Putin never predicted the war would last this long. His so-called special military operation was supposed to be over in a matter of weeks or even days, and if all went to plan, Russia will be able to install a puppet government in Ukraine, claim ownership of numerous new territories like Donetsk and Luhansk, and suffer only the mildest economic losses as a result of whatever sanctions the Western world might impose. Plus, there would still be a significant chunk of the Putin war chest left over to use for additional invasions, should Russia decide to take things further, perhaps even attacking a NATO nation like one of the Baltic states. The Kremlin could also have dispensed some of its reserves into the Russian economy, effectively improving the lives of its people, building momentum and support for whatever war came next. It was a smart plan in many ways, but it was entirely reliant on Ukraine essentially rolling over and waving the white flag, allowing the Kremlin's soldiers to march all the way to Kyiv and raise the Russian flag. As we all know, that's not what happened. Instead, the war has dragged on for several years now, and Russia seems no closer to winning today than it did back in 2022. It's capturing land at a snail's pace, struggling to make gains in areas that matter most, and losing both troops and pieces of military hardware at rates not seen since the Second World War. It's all thanks to Ukraine's remarkable resilience. Rather than simply letting Russia have its way, the Ukrainian people stood up, dug in, and defended their ground with extraordinary strength and courage. They mounted heroic defenses up and down their land, far and wide along the front lines and beyond, and so rather than keeping its war chest stocked up and ready to go for additional invasions and domestic economic support, the Kremlin has been forced to reach into its reserves and spend some more, just to keep its war machine chugging along. Over time, that war chest has been depleted, and all of the carefully laid plans that Putin put into place more than a decade ago have slowly started to unravel. Now Putin has problems even he cannot fix, because it's becoming increasingly clear to all that if Russia really wants to win this war, it will have to keep fighting for many more years to come. Some experts, like former MI6 spy chief Sir Richard Dearlove, even estimate that it could take a staggering 80 years for Russia to capture Ukraine in its entirety if it maintained its current rate of progress. And the fact of the matter is that if Russia did somehow find a way to battle on for decades to come, victory is still not guaranteed. Ukraine is getting stronger all the time, and Russia is getting weaker. If the war were to continue into the 2030s and beyond, it could go either way, and there's no telling how it might turn out. But that's a matter of fantasy anyway, as there's no way the war will possibly last long because of one simple reason: Russia cannot afford it, and there's a growing mountain of evidence to prove that. Even within Russia, experts are now warning that the economy has slowed to such a pace that the country has a huge challenge on its hands to cover the surging costs of defense, security, and society. Alexander Shokin, head of the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, recently told the Rossiya 24 TV channel, "It seems to me that indeed this cooling or managed soft landing is not very soft and not very managed." Shokin went on to state that at the start of 2025, Russian officials believed the country needed at least 2% annual growth to cover its various costs. Unfortunately for the Kremlin, its growth rate is nowhere near 2%. Shokin admitted that Russia would be lucky if it even achieved half of that figure once all the figures from 2025 had been tallied, and numerous analysts agree, with an Interfax poll predicting Russia's economic growth to reach just 1.1% for 2025 when all is said and done. For comparison's sake, in 2024, Russia experienced GDP growth of 4.3%. As Shokin notes, this is low, undoubtedly. Therefore, it's very important that this period of cooling or managed contraction or managed soft landing does not drag on, because a rebound is already needed. He went on to warn that Russia will need to find ways to accelerate growth quickly, explaining, 2% to 2.5% is that optimal economic growth rate for a non-overheated economy that indeed makes it possible to solve a wide range of tasks. To make matters worse, despite its deceleration in growth, Russia is also facing worrying rates of inflation, and everyday Russians are feeling the effects. Not only have the costs of many essential goods almost doubled since the war began, but the average Russian's spending power is dramatically down, leading to less expenditure on high-value goods. Car sales, for instance, are set to drop by 24% in 2025. The Russian budget deficit is rising too, reaching 1.9% in the first 8 months of 2025 and closing in on 2.6% by the close of the year. For a country that's been completely cut off from international borrowing and continues to face the crippling effect of major sanctions from many of the world's biggest economies, that type of deficit is a serious problem. Then there are the challenges facing Russia's oil and gas industry. Their tax revenues have been dropping by around 20% year after year, and over the course of 2025, Ukraine has taken matters into its own hands, launching regular, recurring drone and missile attacks against core pieces of Russian oil infrastructure. Pipelines, refineries, depots, and more have all been brought to their knees, with countless tons of oil going up in smoke and massive fires breaking out all over the country. As a result, Russia is now in the midst of a major fuel crisis, the likes of which it has never seen before. Gas stations are shutting down, fuel supplies are running low, prices are skyrocketing, and a massive amount of Russia's refining capacity has been slashed. And as long as the war goes on, these attacks will continue because Ukraine can see how effective and impactful they are. The Kremlin has resorted to any and all measures it can think of to combat these many challenges. It's been printing massive amounts of money and increasing interest rates, making it almost impossible for many smaller Russian businesses to even continue operations, while preventing average people from being able to take out loans and lines of credit. The government has also imposed limits on converting rubles into other currencies, as well as restrictions on moving rubles out of the country, showing just how far the Kremlin is going in its mission to keep its floundering economy afloat. But it's not enough, because the Kremlin cannot simply undo the enormous damage that this war has done to its economy and society. It can't cancel out the underlying issues, like gigantic labor shortages related to the massive amounts of war casualties and the countless Russians that have fled the country since the war began, or the unsolvable supply chain delays and disruptions caused by international sanctions and a diminishing group of potential trade partners. Russia has also limited access to important resources and technologies, again due to sanctions and the fact that so many countries have no interest in doing business with the Kremlin. On their own, these individual issues could potentially be solvable. However, when they're all added up and compounded by other factors, they create a perfect storm of problems with no possible solution. And it's the Russian people who are growing sick and tired of the situation and making their voices heard. In a recent poll, 66% of citizens stated they were in favor of negotiating with Ukraine rather than persisting with military action against their neighbor. Putin has shown he cares little about the average Russian in the street. He's thrown countless soldiers to their deaths and left innumerable families across his country grieving the loss of sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers since the war began. But he does care about power, and he knows the importance of keeping people largely on his side if he wants to maintain his grasp on power. So even he has been forced to make concessions. Putin has also been exploring plans to increase taxes on the wealthiest citizens of society in order to raise more funds for the Ukraine war as his oil industry suffers. The Kremlin head stated that higher taxes on luxury goods and stock dividends would be a reasonable move to make, and explained that the United States imposed similar measures during previous periods of wartime. In the United States, I don't want to politicize this, during the Vietnam War and the Korean War, that's exactly what they did. They raised taxes specifically on people with high incomes. These decisions from Putin tells us two important things. First, it shows the Kremlin is getting desperate. It's suffering like never before, and the systems and plans it previously relied on and put in place to keep its economy going through the war have either run out or begun to fail. The country no longer has the kind of revenues and economic strength it needs to fund the war in its current state, and it cannot simply print money indefinitely to plug the gaps. Instead, it's having to slash defense spending and seek out new methods to prevent even more serious economic collapse. The second thing this tells us is that, for the time being at least, Putin intends to persist with the war. In many ways, that's understandable. He has repeatedly proclaimed that Ukrainian territories belong to Russia and promised his people victory. To back out now would leave him in the weakest position of his political career. At the same time, Putin must also be able to see what the rest of the world can see, that he is fighting a war that he has no chance of winning, one that has turned into a colossal drain, weakening his economy, his popularity, and his position on the global stage. And it's a situation that is only going to get worse the longer it goes on. For Russia to keep on recruiting enough soldiers to replace those that die or get injured, for example, the country will need to keep on offering increasingly high bonuses and incentives for new recruits. It will also have to continue investing heavily in the defense sector to produce the countless drones, missiles, and other equipment it needs, and the more time passes, the more these challenges will transform from difficult to impossible. In short, the Russian leader is trapped between a rock and a hard place, stuck in a crisis that his usual tactics cannot fix. No amount of lies or propaganda can erase or subtract from the seriousness of the situation. No reckless spending sprees can undo the damage that has already been done. No false promises can paper over the widening cracks spreading across Russian society. Putin has dug a hole so deep he can no longer see the light, and it's only a matter of time before darkness envelops him entirely. You can learn more about the many failures of the Putin regime in recent years in our in-depth breakdown of the Kremlin's catastrophic campaign so far, or check out this video to see how Russia's plan to crush Ukraine actually backfired, turning the Ukrainian armed forces into one of the world's most fearsome military powers. Make sure to subscribe to our channel too, so you can stay informed and up to date on all breaking news and developments from the front lines of the Russia-Ukraine conflict as it continues. And thank you, as always, for watching.